Okay, I think we'll get going. Warm welcome to everyone to this joint webinar between BR UK and Centre UB. I'm chairing it and I'm Susan Mickey. I'm Professor of Health Psychology at UCL and Director of its Centre for Behaviour Change and also co-director of BR UK, and very happy to be chairing this session, which I think will be very interesting and important on the ethics of conducting behavioural research. I'll introduce the others later, the other panelists later, but just to introduce the topic, as I think we're all very aware that behavioural research is playing an increasingly influential role in shaping policies, services, everyday decision making. And with this increasing role becomes also increasing ethical responsibility. And I think it's something we don't talk enough about. We don't talk enough about ethics. We're often not explicit about the values that are shaping, influencing all the consequences of what we do. So in the seminar, we are aiming to do two things. Firstly, to explore the ethical principles that underpin behavioural research. And secondly, to consider how these principles can be translated into research practice. And this will cover issues such as equity, transparency, accountability. I'm sure we'll touch on AI, which is obviously a big one. But just to say that we've already had a webinar specifically on the topic of effective and responsible use of AI. So that can be found on the BR UK website under webinars and events. And we'll put the link in the chat later on. So, if you're specifically interested in that issue, do go and have a look at that webinar. Although, of course, it's not the end of the matter by any means. We're all very familiar with, well, I hope we're all very familiar with research ethics. But I think what we want to focus on are what are the particular issues that are especially important to consider when it comes to behavioural research. Just to say very warm welcome that we have 174 registered participants. Quite often people register to then listen later, but we have quite a number with us. And from a very wide range of sectors, as well as academia, we've got people from private industry, we've got people from the public and third sectors. So I think it should be a very good discussion. And we've ensured that there'll be lots of time for discussion. So please do post your questions and think of what you'd like to say as we go through it. So how we'll organise the session, we've got up to 90 minutes today. And we've got 3 presentations, 10 minutes each, followed by 5 minutes questions. And then we've got 30 minutes at the end. Do post your questions in the Q&A box as you think of them. And we'll do our very best to get through all of those. Very helpful if you can indicate who your question is for. They might be general questions, and that's fine also. And you can upvote any questions you'd like to see answered. So that's very helpful for us to know which are the most popular questions. You can put them anonymously if you want to. They'll be seen by everybody. Because of the way that it's set up, the video for participants is disabled, sadly, so we can't see you. So it's always very nice to know your names if you do ask questions. And if anybody requires closed captioning and can't see this automatically, please click the CC box on your Zoom menu. And just to say that this will be recorded and the recording will be available publicly after the event. It will be on the website. Okay, so now I'm very happy to introduce our 3 panelists. First, in the order in which they're speaking, is Robert West, who's Professor Emeritus of Health Psychology at University College London and has been involved in BR UK research. And he's talking on taking ethical responsibility in behavioural research. Then we have Jessica Pikett. Sorry, I should have asked how you pronounce your name. I hope I got that right. Okay. Who's Professor of Social and Political Geography at the University of Birmingham and a theme lead for Centre UB, which is the sister doctoral training centre to BRUK. And she'll be talking on ethics, evidence, and behavioural expertise, the long journey from research to policy. And thirdly, Professor Liam Delaney, who's head of the Department for Psychological and Behavioural Science at LSE, who will be talking to the title Behavioural Science and Policy, a Landscape View. So I'm looking forward to all the presentations. I'm looking forward to your questions and the subsequent discussion around them. So, Robert, can I hand over to you to kick us off?
Yes, thanks very much. Great. Okay, so should we just go to the first slide? I guess anyone who's working in research ought to, and I guess almost all of us do, have a sense of where ethics fits into our work. And with regard to behavioural research, obviously there's an additional dimension. And I think what I put on this slide is that essentially with behavioural research, you're influencing people's behaviour. You might ultimately be involved in controlling people's behaviour. And what that means is that whatever else we're doing and however else we're doing it, ethics is going to be very much at the heart of everything we do. And so what I'd like to propose in this 10-minute talk is that what that means is that every behavioral scientist should be able to articulate our own set of ethical principles. They won't be the same for everyone, but they'll operate within a broader culture, within your team, within your institution, and within your organization, and within the sector in which you work. And what I'm going to refer to throughout this 10 minutes is a little Substack article I wrote. There's a QR code for the to link to the article, which sets out some of these ideas and principles. But essentially, the key thing is that we all have a sort of general sense about ethics in our work. But what I'd like to suggest is that we actually take that a step further in our work and actually articulate what our ethical principles are. And one of the reasons for doing that is that I'm sure all of you or most of you will have come up against ethical conundrums or ethical quandaries at some point in your careers. And if one's articulated a set of principles, it helps to make you prepared for what's coming. Because without that, and I've experienced this on many occasions, you're faced with a decision that you have to make about something. Actually, sometimes it's not that easy to recognize that there is an ethical issue here and what that ethical issue is and what your principles are that you should be applying. Next slide. So the first part of the context for this is to recognize that, of course, ethics are, they're not fixed in tablets of stone, as it were. They reflect a sort of onion ring of values. That our cultures and society set out certain principles which guide our decision making. And then within those, usually or largely, not always, we create our own principles based on our own upbringing, temperament, and experiences. And these things change over time, and they change with context and with culture and so on. So, things that were once acceptable in society are no longer acceptable, and things that weren't acceptable are. So it's not that there is a fixed set of ethical principles which are always going to apply to everyone to the same degree. And that's part of the issue for us. Next slide, please. When we're thinking about ethical principles, you can identify a set of values which tend to operate within societies. And there are some of these which are particularly relevant to research, and some of these within that are particularly relevant to behavioral research. There are principles and values regarding health, not just of humans, it could be obviously of other species as well, safety, prosperity. Very importantly, when it comes to behavior, there's values regarding liberty, autonomy, agency, and so on, and independence. There are values regarding truth, that is to be honest, integrity, transparency. And then there are values to do with order and particularly social order around justice, discipline, and accountability. And so when we're thinking about the ethical context in which we work and our own ethical principles within that, those values pretty much underpin our approach to those values, underpin how we then approach ethical decisions. And this particular list comes from another Substack article, which was an attempt at a fairly comprehensive classification of human values based on, obviously the huge amount of work that's gone before. Next slide. A crucial point when it comes to ethical decision making within our work is that very often the decisions we make go against our own self-interest. That's what often what ethics means. If it's something that would be in accordance with your self-interest, well, self-interest is what's governing your decision making, and ethics doesn't really come into it. So quite often we're making choices or we have to make ethical choices which go against them. And what that means then, as I was saying earlier, is that it's good to be prepared with an articulated set of principles to help to guide those choices, and to set the guardrails within which one's likely to operate, or which one feels one can operate. Now, when one's talking about ethics, it's very easy to become preachy and say, well, this is what you have to do. These are my ethics, and therefore these have to be your ethics. And obviously that's not the case. Within any area, I know from my own experience working in the field of addiction and smoking and so on, that I do things which go against other people's ethical principles. For example, I will work and do work with the pharmaceutical industry. But I know that there are colleagues who think that that's unethical. So there are guardrails, but the question, to some degree, those guardrails are as ones that you would impose for yourself, and on other occasions, they're ones that your institution or the culture or organization would set for you. Next slide, please. So ethics operates at multiple levels, as I've sort of alluded to. There's our own individual ones, and what you're going to hear later on in this webinar are about ethical principles that operate at the larger scale, either organizational, if we think about UKRI, which has a set of ethical principles, departmental or team, like the UCL Centre for Behaviour Change, and so on. And obviously the broader societal ones, and these all interact and relate to each other. And the wider ones very often set the boundaries within which we can operate as individuals. But those boundaries are often very broad. So as I was saying earlier, looking at my own behavior, I wouldn't work with a tobacco industry or any harm industries or gambling industry or any of those. In fact, there are other companies that other people would work with that I wouldn't work with, but that wouldn't be prohibited necessarily by the organization in which I operate. So the broader organizations, teams, cultures, societies, and so on in which we operate all set boundaries within which we can exercise our own ethical judgment. Next slide. So, in the spirit of that, and talking about tablets of stone earlier on, we have to make, to some degree, our own tablets of stone, and they will not always be ones that we adhere to 100%, but they're ones which will, hopefully, if they're there and they're articulated, will help us to make decisions that are consistent and ethical. And my own tablets of stone, which I just put, these are to some degree personal, to some degree determined by culture and institution, but essentially they come under three categories: values and people, scientific rigor, transparency, and openness. And just to very quickly go through them, right at the top of the list is promoting human well-being and autonomy, protecting our habitat, and prioritizing the most disadvantaged. And I think these are ones that probably everyone here would subscribe to. Obviously, they're very broad, and very often it's hard to know to what extent decisions that we make in our research or the application of our research are ultimately going to promote those values. But I think they're important to have as our sort of overall guiding principle. One would always hope to treat colleagues with respect, regardless of disagreements. And I have to say, if any of you have ever worked in the field of e-cigarettes, but there are many others as well, that is a value that is not always adhered to, and I might not have always fully adhered to it myself. Sometimes it's hard. But nevertheless, it's a value that I think is incredibly important for us all to respect, to pay heed to. One which actually makes a difference, a big difference to very often in behavioral research to what we do, is that I would decline to work with industries, organizations whose products or services cause net harm. And that doesn't just involve the known harm industries like the tobacco industry or the alcohol industry or whatever, but also, there are industries that, one believes oneself, I certainly believe, cause net harm and wouldn't work with, though not on a sort of prescribed list. And then when it comes to scientific rigor, a very important thing for me is to present findings with a confidence that's proportionate to the evidence. And one only has to look through the abstracts of journals like the New England Journal or JAMA or many of the journals that we use on a regular basis to see what in my judgment, that principle violated. And the temptation to do it is really extraordinary. It must be, because otherwise I don't think it would be so common. And to update beliefs as new evidence emerges. These sound like sort of motherhood and apple pie, but I think it's in articulating them that it helps us to make sure that we adhere to them. And if that's what we believe is important. To be reflective about biases that actively work to counter, and actively work to counter them, and obviously to operate within the spirit and the letter of the legal and ethical frameworks within broader frameworks within which we exist, to maximize replicability, to pre-register designs and analysis plans and fully document all analysis. That's very specific, but in my view, not doing that fundamentally, I'm going to sound very preachy here, but I think the evidence is clear that it fundamentally undermines everything we do when we don't do that, because so much of the so many of the findings that are out there are, should we say, questionable as a result of all the problems that arise when you don't do this. And then the last three are to refuse to do studies where the findings can be censored by the funders. I've just turned down some work in which that would have been the case. In fact, it would have been the case that I wouldn't even be allowed to say who the funder was, which is obviously quite inappropriate. And that wasn't a tobacco company. That was a company that you would all know if I gave their name. Follow what are known as the FAIR principles and equator guidelines in data collection and so on, and engage communities affected by the work. So those are just 10 personal examples of sort of commandments that one might operate. Next slide, please. So what does this mean in practice? In my case, as I mentioned earlier, turning down what seem to be sometimes opportunities, making sure that the research topics are ones that are ethical, trying to handle disagreements respectfully. That's the one I probably fail in most. Obey the rules, the spirit and the letter, adopt open science practices, speak out when needed. That's often very difficult to do, and change my views when new evidence comes in. So the idea is that you translate the broad values into concrete actions. Next slide. So I've generated a little ethics quiz. There's a QR code there for you. It's obviously fully anonymous and so on, but it was something that I thought might be fun to help to sort of, I guess, for us to reflect a little bit on A, what our values are, and B, the extent to which we find that we operate those values. So all these slides will be available afterwards, but you might want to have a go at that at some point in your leisure. Next slide, please. And just to reiterate the main point I think I'm trying to make in this part of the webinar, which is, should we all be able to articulate our ethical principles? I think so, even though for 99% of my career, I never did so. That's it.
Thanks very much, Robert. We don't actually have any questions, but we've got a couple of minutes before the next person speaking. So I just wanted to make the point that ethics applies to every single aspect of the research process and all research activities, from what questions do you ask to begin with, what your methods, your research methods are, who do you involve, how do you disseminate or not those findings, and what are you trying to achieve with your research. And it's interesting, you know, research funders ask you a lot about, you know, how are you going to translate your findings, and obviously very detailed exposition of the research methods. And we have to go through ethics committees, which deals with that. But within research proposals, we're not asked to, generally speaking, highlight ethical issues that there might be there, you know, within the whole research. So I think it's just useful to think about all of research activities and think about all the principles that Robert outlined in relation to every single stage, because, you know, one might say it's not ethical not to involve the general population in setting research agendas, for example. These are the kind of big issues we might come back to later, but just to get you thinking about it. Good. Okay. So thanks very much.
There were just a couple of questions.
Ah, right. Okay. Well, we don't actually have time now to.
I'll type my answer, so you'll see it.
But can you pick those up when we come to the general discussion at the end? But these are very, very good questions.
Yeah, what I was suggesting, that I type my answer. No.
Yeah. Okay. That's absolutely fine. Good. Okay. Yeah. Good. Okay. Thank you very much, and welcome, Professor Jessica Pikett. Over to you. Thank you
very much. Yeah, thank you very much for involving me in the panel, and thanks to all the participants for taking time out of their day to be with us today. So I'm going to talk about, we just heard there about the kind of principles, foundational principles, values, and how culturally specific they may be of the actual research context. But I'm going to talk about the kind of the stage after research, which is the application of research findings, specifically behavioural research in policy and applied policy settings. And this is research informed by kind of governance and public administration theories. So if we could start with the first slide, please. So there's not time to go into the full history of the emergence and the spread of what became known as behavioural public policies, what was popularly known as nudging in the early 2000s. But there's a few books indicated there which detail in a kind of and document that history in some depth, looking at the influence of American behavioural economists on UK public policy, specifically looking at the kind of prehistory of behavioural economics from the 60s and 70s, and what kind of changed in between that and the kind of popularization in nudge and in popular psychology of these ideas, and how those ideas got adopted in the UK, what they reflected in terms of the cultural and governmental values of the UK in relation to the New Labour project of the real third way. It was proposed that nudging would be the mechanisms by which the real third way would be kind of manifested. Also, the coalition government around that time, 2010, saw nudging and libertarian paternalism as a really useful way to justify austerity type of policies, to do more with less. So this work drew on interviews with over 100 behavioural scientists, policymakers, behaviour change organisations, and is really looking at how and why and practically how does behavioural research become influential in public policy settings. There's no inevitability to that trend. It was never inevitable that something called behavioural public policy would be produced. There are mechanisms and ways in which that was produced. The way in which knowledge is produced and selected and prioritised is always culturally and politically specific. So we did, along with my colleagues, also from human geography discipline, Mark Whitehead, Rhys Jones and others, write several books on this topic. The Rise of the Psychological State introduced this new word called neuroliberalism to try and kind of diagnose and analyse what we saw as these trends of looking at behavioural science, brain science, and psychology, and the way in which those to different degrees became adopted in public policy. And we were interested to do this because there were many emerging critiques. There was worry about the kind of cumulative impact of behavioural public policies as a kind of series of tools and mechanisms which popularised psychology and behavioural economics in policy. But also because some of those criticisms coming from philosophy, coming from economics, social science disciplines more widely, were concerned about the kind of values that Robert has talked about, things like agency, things like autonomy, whether they were too paternalistic, whether they were creating neoliberal solutions to neoliberal kind of problems, or whether they were simply too trivial to be effective. So on the one hand, sense that there's a kind of conspiracy of behavioural economics taking over government processes, but also concerns and critiques that these were quite trivial, that they didn't amount to much. So quite contrasting critiques there. So we're engaging with those critiques and along with others, including political economist Mark Fabian, looking at the distinctions and the ethical distinctions between well-being public policies and behavioural public policies. And then looking at the kind of alternatives which have been proposed by many scholars, including Peter John, including Banerjee et al. Here, thinking about how do we insert and import agency and focus on agency within behavioural public policies, but also how do we boost and empower people's ability to deal with biases rather than kind of circumventing those biases in our policy programmes. So there are many ethical concerns which still remain after all this debate over the past 20 years. COVID, for instance, really highlighted that there's some kind of underlying issues, the issue of behavioural scientists being an integral part or prioritised part of the kind of SAGE group of scientific advice to government, and promoting certain kinds of contested theories such as herd behaviours and behavioural fatigue. A lot of debate as to whether that was the case in reality, but that was certainly reported, and kind of public kind of scepticism towards behavioural science was emerging during that time. So if we go to the next slide, please. So I wanted to just raise today a few ethical challenges and point you, hopefully these links work when you click on them, to this short report, which was trying to create very short ways and kind of playing cards that policymakers and different behaviour change organisations can use to raise a number of ethical dilemmas and discuss and debate them. So this is based on approach to ethics, which is dialogical ethics. So it's the idea that ethics there are not necessarily foundational values, but we produce those values through our interactions and through our debates and discourses and conversations. So there are clearly some key ethical issues around transparency, non-manipulation, accountability, which are really important. But in this report, I focus on three main things. Whether the problem is being framed as behavioural, social, or structural is really important. So if a problem is framed from a behavioural science perspective, there's a risk that the only solutions being considered might also be behavioural interventions. And these may not be effective if the real and perhaps unobservable causes are social, spatial, or structural. And just to give an example of that, climate change clearly is not solvable through individual people recycling. There are kind of interests, there are polluter pays principles. Individuals aren't as responsible as other people and other organizations, nation states, corporations, geopolitical issues. So it's about kind of expanding the scope of defining the problem area. Secondly, cultures of expertise, the kind of critique that we were being kind of governed by experts, behavioural experts. So there's some skepticism in political theory towards that. What we were trying to do in our work is to think about how knowledge is produced, how it's prioritised, how it's legitimised, what forms of expertise are being used, and is there any kind of risk of kind of oversight or blind spots within the kind of behavioural science realm as a kind of disciplinary perspective, albeit a kind of wide one. And then evidence pluralism. Similarly, we talked earlier, Susan raised the point about whether it's ethical to not include the public in setting research agendas. And so there are methods, there are disciplines which do this as a matter of course, co-production and co-design type of methods, using lived experience, ethnographic insights, and deliberative research methods for knowledge production. So that is a kind of alternative to that government by expertise or technocratic type of government that the research community has got at its disposal. So there's some ethical issues. And if we go to the next slide, I'll show you how we've been trying to address these issues. Thank you. So where we started with we have a new project called Ethics and Expertise in Times of Crisis, which is funded by the SRC. And in this work, we started off by reviewing ethical frameworks that already exist. You'll hear from next speaker about the For Good framework, and that is one of the ones that we looked at. We looked at a kind of selected group of frameworks and tried to look across them. What are the kind of categories of how do they work? What are the kind of categories of principles and values that are embedded within them? And we saw that some issues were perhaps missing. So the drive towards scientific pluralism that I mentioned is not something that's being commonly called for in these ethical frameworks. Questions of authority and legitimacy for experts is not necessarily something which is in these kind of checkbox type exercises. Transparency is certainly there, but maybe the wider kind of open science debates had not yet happened in that period. And then there's a sense of drawing false equivalences between effectiveness and efficiency and ethics. So the notion that the evidence says it can be done is sometimes said to be enough. So just evidence-based policy kind of actually tends to disregard that long journey between research and policy. And then finally, theories of power tend to be absent. And if you want to look at some of the detail of how we kind of categorize these ethics frameworks and look at what those ethics frameworks were, then you can click on that link there. And then the next slide. All of this kind of research made us really want to understand better what ethics advice is, how are governments dealing with ethics advice, what is the format of ethics knowledge, what is ethics, how is ethics being defined in policymakers, amongst policymakers. So then launched a kind of international project, comparative project with Australia and Germany and the UK, looking at this question of ethics advisory ecosystems. And this we regarded as really important because, as you may remember, Boris Johnson during COVID fired two of his ethics advisors. There was a sense that ethics was something for other people, and so that was a major gap, a kind of disregard for ethics. But also there's a kind of, whilst there is a lot of scholarship on the science policy interface, there is not so much scholarship on the ethics policy interface, and it raises different questions because of the nature of ethics knowledge that Robert described, that it's values based, it's shifting, it's dynamic, it's culturally specific. So we were interested in thinking about how ethics advice is commissioned, how it's delivered, and some of the kind of missteps of simply following the science, and instead kind of appreciating the long journey and the complexity and uncertainty between knowledge that's produced or research and application in policy. So we thought this was really important because ethics is frequently overlooked in times of crisis, COVID being one time when it was overlooked, environmental disasters, floods, fires, for instance, or public health emergencies, cyber attacks, lots of kind of crisis moments, at which point speed and urgency is of the essence, but can have the effect of displacing ethics knowledge. And yet policymakers we've consulted with have expressed a kind of fear of mission creep. They're concerned about making political decisions rather than impartial decisions. But they all are very enthusiastic about knowledge and training, which helps them to navigate value conflicts in their everyday working practices. So hence we then started to focus on ethics skills and how ethical skills are being developed. Rather than thinking of, if we could go to the next slide, rather than thinking of ethics as a kind of behaviour, which is how the training is generally given in the civil service. It's kind of mandatory training on public integrity, codes of conduct, and so on. So that treats ethics as a set of behaviours. It may well be a set of behaviours, but we also think it's a specific body of knowledge. It has a set of skills and kind of capabilities, whether that's a personal level of developing skills and knowledge, but also institutional knowledge of particular policy bodies. So this is where we started looking at the kind of in detail of the policy making process and how a kind of ethics tool could be developed, which is embedding ethical insights into policy making, rather like the way in which behavioural insights have been embedded and entrenched in infrastructures of policy making. So we partner with the Nuffield Council of Bioethics on this work, and we'll be launching a tool, decision making support tool for policymakers in July. So this is recognising that the way in which ethics knowledge is defined is very important, but also that the kind of skills of identifying ethical controversies and issues and justifying judgments transparently are also important. And there are many challenges that policymakers face here in terms of recognising what is a value judgment, of drawing boundaries between politics and ethics, of dealing with uncertainty, of using ethics for kind of vocabulary, and the increasing fragmentation of ethics advice as well. So one of the things we did on one of the previous slides was map kind of ethics institutions nationally. And we did that in the 3 different countries, incredibly complex kind of stakeholder maps of different ethics advice for different government departments and different sectors. So there can be AI ethics, there can be climate ethics, there can be data ethics. And quite often it's very difficult for policy makers to know where to search for experts and at what point in the policy making cycle to involve ethical experts. So we're trying to encourage in this work kind of reflexive learning and what I mentioned before, the dialogic ethics. So this has been co-developed with policy professionals, and we're currently trialling its use. So if you'd like to get involved in that before it's published, then please do get in touch, and we'll arrange a free workshop introducing the ideas. And you can also join our network called Ethics, Evidence and Policy via LinkedIn. Thanks very much.
Jessica, thank you very much. really interesting and great to see this tool being developed, which I'm sure will be of great interest. Again, we don't have questions, but also the time is up. But I'll just raise one issue maybe for people to think about. I noticed that Robert used the word autonomy in his list of 10 commandments. You haven't used that word, you've used the word agency. And one issue I think is to think about the cultural context and the social influences on our ethical values. Because in many parts of the world, autonomy isn't regarded as important as collective good. The collective good is seen as more important than the individual good on many, many levels. So I think it's just useful and I presume agency is agency of the individual or agency of the collective, whatever the collective might be. So anyway, that's just one issue that people might like to pick up.
Really important point, and it does link to this notion of capabilities as well. Are we capable?
We'll come back to it in the general discussion. I'm just trying to provoke people to ask some questions, or indeed do make some points. You don't have to ask questions. If you disagree with anything that anybody said, feel free to put it in the Q&As. Thank you very much, Jessica. And Liam, our third and final speaker, over to you.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you, Robert and Jessica, for those really rich talks. And I want to pick up on a thread that runs through both of them, which is the distance between having ethical principles and actually embedding them into organizations and systems that are doing this work every day. So I call this a landscape view because behavioral science now is diffused across many different types of organizations. So we have behavioral frameworks, research methods, policy design tools. Institutions have developed and categories of units within institutions have developed that rely heavily on behavioral science. So my focus is on the broad ethics of these and the governance dimensions of them, and practically how do you make ethics real when you have all of these new capacities developing across many different areas. There's obviously a long history in the UK and elsewhere of social and behavioral science being embedded into government, but there has been a step change in the last 20 years. You're seeing a lot of explicit behavioral teams developing in areas that may have been informed by these areas before, but not having specific capacities. I'm thinking of areas like financial regulation, tax compliance, etc., etc. So areas that clearly had long traditions of embedding behavioral science in different ways, but that has really scaled up. So we're moving from areas where, things like bioethics, where there's incredibly detailed ethical frameworks, into areas where the capacities themselves are evolving very rapidly. And my journey was, building behavioral science programs in the mid 2000s and onwards, and working with students who were working in large private sector organizations, government, regulation, and so on, and really trying to do whatever we could to build ethical frameworks that allowed them to navigate many of these challenges as they were going through. So next slide, please, Sancha. So yeah, a brief overview. So behavioral science is now, I think, genuinely embedded in how governments operate across the world. As I said, across areas like tax compliance, regulation, as well as areas that have traditionally been there, like health and environment. So it's exciting, but as the capacity expands, there is a need to have more pragmatic ethical tools that can be used by policymakers and by folks working in large organizations or any size organizations really across the public, private sector, NGOs, etc. And I said, how can this be institutionalized within organizations? And a key word for me is pragmatism. We're not primarily moral philosophers that work in these areas. We need to have frameworks that can be embedded within these organizations, nor do we have infinite time when you're working on policy problems. And many of the policymakers on the call will know the feeling of time constraint and the many different inputs that are being pushed onto them. So if we do develop ethical frameworks, they must be pragmatic, they must be adaptable to the language of public policy and to the timeframes of public policy, or else they'll reside primarily in the academic seminar room and not in the domain of public policy. And that's what we've been trying to do with these areas. Sorry, with the development of this framework. So next slide, please, Sancha. And this is the type of scale. So this comes from Faisal Naru, who initially developed this map with the OECD and published a really nice paper on the behavioral science units all across the world. So this is not a cottage industry anymore. You've got infrastructure applying behavioral techniques at scale. And obviously, we've got the emergence of AI, which is going to amplify a lot of these capacities, personalize them to a greater extent. So these are now, major capacities of government, major capacities of private organizations, and they create power structures. They create people that can, engineer policy outcomes in a way that don't go through traditional legislative or parliamentary structures within these countries. So, having well established ethical frameworks becomes more important and increasingly important over time. So next slide, please, Sancha. So over about a decade, working with executives and with students and with policy folks, Leonard Landes and I, in a field that probably already has too many acronyms, added another acronym. And I think this is technically an acronym, not an initialism, as people have been debating online recently. So we developed a framework which took a lot of the debate about the ethics of behavioral science and tried to drag it from a sort of political philosophy debate, which I think it got a little bit stuck on. There's a lot of people who are concerned about whether these policies are libertarian or paternalistic or whatever. And in practice, they're very context specific, and actually probably more culturally applicable than you might think. So, default options and the ethics of them apply in all sorts of societies, how primes work, etc., etc. And in general, when you're looking at behavioral policies, you want something that will allow you to respect the complexity and the context of the domain that you're looking at and the problem that you're looking at. And we're not overly wedded to this. This must span everything, and it has developed over time in different ways. But clearly, any ethical account must look at fairness and must look at the complexity of the dimensionality of fairness, and that can include things that economists would look like economic distribution features, but also complex sort of psychological dimensions of fairness, transparency and openness. And I think I would go so far as to say I've never seen a justification for not having transparent behavioral policy in public settings. There may be cases in private settings where proprietary information isn't shared with the public, and that's complex. But I really don't, in any walk of life, think there's a case for hiding what you're doing as a government if it's a behavioural policy. And then the complexities of the dimension of respect, dignity, and I think autonomy is an important word in these phrases, agency, as Susan alluded to. Goals, many behavioural policies would probably not occur if people reflected really on what they were trying to do with them. And we know in policy, sometimes policies get stuck, get handed down from government to government, etc. So I think with all behavioural policies, looking clearly at what the goals are and the legitimacy of those goals, opinions being a very broad category, and over time, and Jessica alluded to people like Peter John, and I totally agree with Peter's, and a wider literature which has looked at the need for public and citizen involvement in behavioural public policies. I think that's something we'd all share as panelists, that these cannot be technocratic, top-down, agency-less policies. I think there have been some, I think, well-founded critiques of some of the behavioural literature that, what is your ultimate vision? Is your vision people using AI to sort of, be able to get people to do whatever they want, regardless of how, regardless whether people have been consulted about it and so on. And clearly some of those visions, when you scale them up, are very unpleasant. And I think a broader ethical account of behavioural public policy in an age of AI must be one where there's a proper account of citizen involvement, consultation, engagement, co-creation. And there's many good ideas across the piece around how that would be achieved. But for us, it must be articulated at very least. So if one is going to develop behavioural policies at scale, and I think that's well established across many areas of health, across many areas of public policy, that there should be rigorous accounts of how you consult, how you involve. And then, of course, there's a big, and I think an interesting discussion, maybe one that has been overplayed a bit, as to whether behavioural policies are leading to a lack of focus on broader systemic issues. I'd push back a little bit about that. I think if you look at something like pension auto-enrollment, Yes, it's a behavioral policy that focuses on a specific mechanism, but it also, requires legislation. It's scaled over society, etc. But there is a discussion, for example, about whether a focus on things like individual recycling detracts from looking at things like carbon taxes and so on. And again, I would say, without getting carried away with that, I think it's a reflection that should be there. And if you find yourself, in a behavioral agency or working on a behavioral problem, and you realize, the whole point of it is to basically distract people from other aims, that's an ethical reflection to keep in mind. And again, going back to something that Jessica said, delegation, what's the right mix of people? And in many circumstances, people are willing to delegate agency in complex issues, and are willing to have people design elements of their choice. You walk into an airport, you want the airport to be well signposted, and one can think about that. Like, people want financial products to be designed in a way that allow them to achieve their financial goals. And again, the question with these things become, under what circumstances are people willing to delegate agency? What's the right mix of expertise when you're looking at behavioral policies, and how are they legitimized and trust? So final slide, please, Sancha. Or is that my final slide? Yeah. So onto the Q&A. So I'll just finish by saying we really are at a very interesting time for this. It's behavioral science is scaled up over many different agencies. The development of AI augmented behavioral methods will allow for a lot of personalization, a lot of scaling of behavioral techniques, and that makes the need for ethically better designed behavioral policies that include consultation and very explicit focus on things like fairness, openness, respect, makes it all the more important. So I'm happy to dig into any of those dimensions. We've worked with the OECD to develop things like checklists, and through our own initiative in LSE, we've developed things like pre-mortem tools that can be used for policymakers, and I'm happy to share any of them. And we're working a lot with policy and with industry to make these very, very usable, very scalable, very rapid. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Liam. That's really good to hear about this framework. We haven't got any questions as far as I can see on the Q&As. So maybe I could invite Jessica and Robert to rejoin the panel and start off with a couple of questions for Robert, one of which I managed to delete from the open bit. I pressed the wrong button and so it disappeared. But it is under the answered, which it hasn't been answered. So can I read that out to begin with? It says, Robert, when a product uses behavioural nudges to drive adoption of a desired behaviour, at what point does, quote, choice architecture become manipulation? And who decides where that line is? Now, I'm sure all the panelists have got views on that, but Robert, let's start with you.
Yeah, so I think one thing that becomes evident when you get into the weeds of this is that ultimately there's no ducking the fact that when you are engaging in a behavioral intervention, you are seeking to change behavior. And sometimes that the behavior that you're seeking to change is one that the people or the person wants to change themselves already. And so you are helping them to do something they want to do. For example, most of my work's been looking at helping people to stop smoking who want to stop smoking, and who would and otherwise would maybe fail. So that's relatively straightforward. But so much of what we do is not that. So much of what we do is influencing people's motivation. So, for example, if I get involved with a Department of Health campaign to increase the rate at which people attend stop smoking services or try to stop smoking, then there's an element to that where you're influencing people's motivation, and so there's never a case really where you could just forget about it and say, it's okay. You've always got to think about, is that okay? And whether it's okay or not. We've heard, from Liam and Jessica about the broader moral frameworks and the organizational ones, and these are incredibly important because they can help to guide us as individuals in what we choose to do. I mean, very important, and in institutions, and sets, as I was saying earlier, sort of set the guardrails. But there is no getting away from the fact that a lot of what we do is influencing behavior in a way that goes beyond helping people to do something they're already committed to doing. And then the question becomes who decides, and again, there's no getting away from the fact that that one is applying values, and that's where values like promoting health and well-being, promoting autonomy, all these other things come into play, because they exist within this sort of moral ethical framework. And I guess what I'm saying is that there's never any way of ducking the issue. It's always something that we have to confront, and we always have to confront the fact that if we're influencing motivation, particularly, as opposed to capability or opportunity to engage in a behavior, if we're influencing motivation, then we are potentially having to balance other values like health and well-being against, to some degree, agency, potentially. We can use the guardrails, we can use the frameworks, and these are all incredibly important. But ultimately, someone decides, we decide, and not doing something is also an ethical choice. If you say, I could do this intervention and it would have this effect, but it would also have this effect, that is a choice that you're making. And so there's no ducking it, I guess, is what I'm saying. And probably there shouldn't be.
Okay, thanks. So when does choice architecture become manipulation? Jessica or Liam, did you want to share your thoughts on that?
Yeah, happily throw my 2-bit in. So I think that is a really important question. And one thing to think about is that every intervention requires some kind of legitimacy, but who is kind of intervening is also a really key question. Who has got the kind of the justification to act, and in whose interests? So I think Liam mentioned the difference between a commercial organisation doing an intervention versus a government. So the standards that we hold governments to in terms of public trust, in terms of safeguarding the common good, would be different than a commercial company. And we also need to think about to what extent we willfully kind of submit ourselves on a regular basis to manipulation, and why is it that we do that culturally? Are there things that can be done, behavioural interventions in terms of terms and conditions of various products, that could actually support our own agency and boost our capacity to not make kind of biased decisions? So there's just a few thoughts on that.
Thanks.
I mean, it's a great question, and I think you can make the ethical aspects of private action explicit. I think if you look at social media, for example, it's been interesting how layered it's become, our discussion about influence techniques in social media, and it's leading to a better public discussion. Just one thing I would say, I think within regulation, we need to get better identifying harm, behavioral harm, and what that implies for regulation when it comes to things like financial regulation, social media regulation, etc. And in the evolution of AI, I think we need to be better at identifying what we mean by behavioral techniques causing harm, and setting some red lines for particularly, and look at something like online gambling, setting red lines for particular types of harm. And then we can all have our opinion about what's the domain of, I heard a great phrase once, mere commercial contrivance, which would be, we live in a free society. Companies are going to market stuff to you, and there's an element to which, whether you then want to look at every single instance of a behavioral manipulation as being something that's a policy motivation is an open question. But I think my answer to the question would be a criteria for harm, whether that's post-decision regret, psychological distress, expert judgment. So if people are clearly making decisions that are counter to their long-run well-being, that's not itself a reason to regulate away the behaviour, but it's at least a good prima facie case. And there's been, good work done in financial regulation and other areas like that. And I think to me, it's a very good area of behavioural public policy, which is just looking at these criteria. Thanks.
Thanks. And it's interesting thinking about just the words that are used. I mean, these all convey an attitude often, whether we talk about changing behaviour or manipulating behaviour or enabling behaviour change. These all have different connotations that I think is worth thinking about. And people use these words for particular motives. So I think there's a lot that's implicit that needs to be explicit if we really are going to be ethical in our interactions and communications and general work. We've got a number of excellent questions. I'm just going to start off with a comment from Garda bin Suwaid that starts, excellent reflection, Susan. So I always like comments like that. Within cultural contexts such as Saudi Arabia, behavioural patterns and policies are very much shaped by collective social norms rather than individual agency or autonomy. This highlights the need to critically examine how ethics in behavioural public policy is framed and where it may require contextual adaptation or challenge. And I would say I would go beyond that. It's not just about behavioural public policy, but I think all behavioural research and all research, or a lot of research, certainly social and behavioural research. But I wanted to go on to so some of the other questions here. We can come back to that if this time. Is it actually an ethical issue if we're being asked by governments to develop interventions that target individual and household behaviour rather than addressing much wider systemic issues that are, quote, off limits due to intensive lobbying by vested interests? That's from an anonymous person. Liam, you want to
Let me just take that for a second, because I mean, look, clearly Chater and Lowenstein have written that paper about the I-frame and S-frame to suggest that that's happening.
Could you just say what I-frame and S-frame
so
refer to?
You can think of an individual frame where we try to conceptualize these broad problems within individualistic terms versus a societal frame where we take a systemic. My own view is the last thing we needed in these literatures was another arbitrary dichotomy. Like in most of these areas, it is of course a complex bunch of multi-level phenomenon going on, and you have to match the complexity. And I just want to push back a little bit, because I think the obvious answer to the question is you are of course right. This is happening to an extent, and there's lots of vested interests that want to individualize problems and take it away from societal issues. But I think there is a baby being thrown out, which is you can go back into the system all you want, but when you come back through, you're still looking at individuals and households trying to manage a huge amount of complexity. And I would give you pension auto enrollment as an example. I'll give EV adoption as an example. We are getting it completely wrong. For example, on climate change, because we're not designing the interaction between the system and the individual and the household. And it's partly because some people are too focused on the individual, and it's partly because some people are so focused on the system that they operate at that level and they never come down to the level where people are actually trying to achieve these things and failing because the system is poorly designed at that level. So I just want to say that, like, I think we can easily follow Chater Lowenstein, in other words, down this path, but we're going to miss a really important part, which is that intersection. We should all be intersectionalists, basically, between levels of a system.
I think you're absolutely right, of course, and I would hope that everybody would agree with that. But I think one of the issues is there's only so much research funding. There's only so many researchers around, and what are they being directed to do? And my interpretation of this question is, is it ethical if we're being steered to just focus on the individual and the household rather than the bigger systemic issues? And Jessica, before I bring you in, I just wanted to reflect on during COVID, for example, there was a big attention on hand washing, long after the science showed that it was the virus was being transmitted by aerosol. So hand washing wasn't as important as was originally thought. And, quite a lot of investment went into the hand hygiene and a lot of focus on that. And there was definitely a narrative around that one of the reasons for this was a political and social reason, that this is something that is down to individual responsibility. Whereas as soon as you get to the point of we need clean, safe air, that becomes the responsibility of organisations, of local government, etc., which costs money and political will at that level. Much easier to just not have responsibility and say, just keep washing your hands. So anyway, that's an example, I think, of what's being talked about there. Jessica.
Yeah, I just wanted to come back to what something you had said earlier, Susan, which is the kind of the need to think about ethics at every stage of the research process. And this includes the kind of upstream framing of the research problem from different disciplinary perspectives. And each discipline has got a series of blind spots. So this is kind of just a call for interdisciplinary work and thinking across the system and individual. And there are frameworks that do that. Of course, the Behaviour Change Wheel does that. The kind of sociological research on practices instead of behaviours really integrates kind of context and structural issues into people's everyday habits. So there are theoretical frameworks, methodologies which enable us to do that. So yeah, we should get on and do it ethically.
Can I make a point, Susan? Because the sort of the other side of the sort of implication of the question is an organization, a governmental organization, let us say, is putting out a call for, or asking you maybe even to do a contract to do some work that you feel is, for whatever reason, is creating an opportunity cost with regard to other work that could be done that would be more effective. I see this, for example, in the gambling field, where I think a lot of the research that's funded is focused on treatment and so on, rather than the broader sort of societal level interventions that would probably have more impact at a larger scale. So that's a very tricky question for someone. Do you engage with that and go, okay, well, it is what it is. This is what the funding source is, or do you push back? Or you just have nothing to do with it. And I think most of us, or most people who rely on research income, or who could benefit from it, would probably go, okay, it's not a great area, and it might not make much difference, but what can you do? And so I think it is a real ethical question for people. And one thing one can do, and one potentially, is to look to push back against things like that. Okay, you may go for the contract, you may answer the call, but you can also comment. You can also go back and say, well, and okay, maybe it's a drop in the ocean if it's just you, but maybe if other people do it as well, it actually pushes back. So I think there is a case for us as researchers to be citizens, and even when we're engaging with something, as for whatever reason, to comment and to push back against things that we think are misplaced or misdirected.
Thanks. Okay, on to the next question, which is an important one about, I don't think we've touched on as yet, which is about balancing competing values. Life is never straightforward. So this is from Catherine Buckle, how do you balance competing values? For example, in the development sector, there is a big emphasis on value for money, using money in an efficient and cost-effective way, which often directly contradicts considerations of fair pay and working conditions, especially for temporary workers and consultants, e.g. data collectors for research studies. How do you balance sector-level ethics with individual needs and avoiding harm? Big question.
I'll have a go at starting with a small answer, if that's okay. One way of tackling this question could actually be to think about the dynamic nature of values that was alluded to earlier, and to really think about how our kind of infrastructures, decision-making infrastructures, already have within them a particular set of values. So cost effectiveness is an important value in any kind of public sector decision. But we also need to have the imagination, the moral imagination, one might say, to think in a kind of more left field way about where those values come from, how values could change in the future. Do those values reflect the kind of contemporary cultural sensitivities? So where do the values come from is a really important question, and how might they change in the future, and how do we think beyond the current values to other worlds that might be possible?
Mm.
Thanks.
One way of doing it, clearly there are no sort of absolutist right or wrong answers, but one way of doing it that I try and apply is a sort of should we say, taking a sort of consequentialist view, a sort of moral calculus, and of things that at least one can take what one's got data on or evidence on. In the case of smoking, for example, as I've sort of alluded to, there's a lot of controversy about electronic cigarettes and so on. And a lot of the ethical judgments that are being made in that area are being made on sort of principles rather than consequentialist type value judgments. So you should never work with the tobacco industry, which is is a fair point. But if you have data that would allow you to take a consequentialist view, then you can do some kind of calculus about, for example, harm reduction as a policy, and about what kind of research is more likely to be productive than what other kind of research. It's not that the things are always going to be cut and dried, and sometimes you just don't have the evidence to be able to make a judgment, but sometimes you do. And what sometimes I find ups or distressing, shall we say, is when there is that evidence there. You can do those judgments. You can even do a pretty solid calculation about how many lives would be saved, how many life years would be saved for doing this rather than that. And people are not doing that. They're not applying that kind of judgment. They're sort of saying, no, that's not the problem. The problem is that we've got to go after these people. We've got to take this principled view. And I think you can take that view as long as you're willing to accept the fact that if people follow that, then people are going to die who would otherwise have lived.
I think that's all very right. But also I think one's often got to ask the question for whom, because often consequences are differential for different groups of people. And the same with values. Different people may hold different values more or less strongly. So I think one of the issues is to make sure that one always thinks in a sufficiently complex way about the context in which any activity is being done. And also, not to think that as researchers, we are the ones that know best. We generally come from a rather narrow slice of society, and often we're doing research on issues that are quite rightly to do with the whole breadth of society. And goes back to what I was saying before. I think one of the really important things is participatory research to ensure that voices are heard, and voices that aren't usually heard, and putting resources and developing capabilities in what's the best way of bringing those voices into the whole research process. For many years, I was on NICE. I don't know if people know NICE, that develops the evidence-based guidelines for healthcare and public health. So I was, I think, 8 years on the Public Health Advisory Committee. And, we used to have 2 people that were meant to be the lay voices. And this sort of thing doesn't really make sense, because who are they representing? How do their voices really get through in a group of 20, very confident, talkative researchers? And so there are many different ways of going and finding out about people's lived experiences and their perspectives. And I think in terms of balancing competing values, I would say that is really important, kind of finding out values for whom, consequences for whom, and then thinking about how those can be brought together. But there's no shortcut, I don't think, other than having really good representation of all the people in society that the research will affect in one way or another. Okay, if we feel we've had enough on that one, obviously we could spend hours on a lot of these. Next one, again, very interesting one. How feasible is it to, in moments of crisis, devote time to ensuring policies are open to the public and are effective instead of efficient? Is there a shortcut to ensuring ethics in behavioural public policy, but also to ensuring ethics in behavioural public policy, but also being prompt to implement the policies? So I think this is about what happens in crisis where we have to act quickly. How do we do things without sacrificing ethics in the work we do? Excellent question, Liam.
Yeah, it's absolutely clear to me that there's not a trade-off between transparency and effectiveness in crisis. And you saw that at the start of COVID. What happened in Britain at the start of COVID was a confusion as to the role of the behavioral science, which itself then transmitted into a widespread confusion in the public as to what the actual policy was in Britain. And a lot of that confusion would have been resolved if all of the minutes of the meetings at which behavioural stuff was being discussed in the run-up to COVID had been fully available for everyone to look at, and it would have taken the heat out of it straight away. There's nothing you should be doing in a meeting with a government official as a behavioural person that you shouldn't be quite happy to publicise. I really believe that. I can't think of, and I don't care, you can give me intelligence examples, you can give me whatever. You should not come out of a meeting with a government official thinking, I can't talk about that. Now, there may be cases in which you're bound to do that by the nature of the interaction, but I would say that those sorts of interactions are not well constructed, because think of the history of, sort of hidden behavioral science. It always, when it turns out when it's unhidden, it was probably not the right thing to do. It was hidden for a reason. So sorry, I'm kind of overdoing the point a little bit. I really believe this. I think behavioral science embedded in the state should be transparent. It should be a useful thing. The public should feel it's on their side. They should have a role in it. They should participate in it. And that is more important in a time of crisis, when you need big collective trust in what's happening, good communication, etc. And what we learned from COVID was that it hurts it hurts the actual response in a way that, like, we were talking, think about February 2020, March 2020, we ended up actually in a discussion about the ethics of behavioral science as much as a discussion about how we transparently respond to a pandemic. And that should never happen again. It really should never happen again. I think actually one of the things BR UK can do is to make sure that that doesn't happen again. What we do for the state and us should have no problem telling people about it. And that improves efficiency, and it improves effectiveness, and it improves public trust in institutions. Sorry, that was my TED talk. I'll stop now.
No, completely agree with you. And I think there are two issues. One was transparency, and one was behavioural science, particularly that certain people seem to want to give a bad name. Maybe that's a whole other seminar that'd be quite interesting. But on the transparency, if you remember, when SAGE was refusing to publish its membership, its minutes, its agendas, etc. So David King, who'd been a chief scientific advisor under both Blair and Brown, was so shocked by this secrecy because he completely believed in openness and transparency. And in fact, during the BSE crisis, he got permission to speak directly to the public. So he, from both Blair and Brown, he spoke directly to the public. He wasn't on a platform there with politicians sort of minders either side of him. And so he thought that was a really important principle, and set up Independent SAGE, which both Robert and I were part of. And that was for scientists to come together to be completely open and transparent, and also answer people's questions you know, ordinary people's questions and media questions and politicians' questions, you know, rather than just be a sort of rather secretive government thing. But actually, within, I think, days of independent SAGE being set up, the powers that be then decided to make SAGE open and transparent. So that was really important. Did anybody else want to comment on this question? If not, I'll go on to, sorry.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention,
Yes,
because
yeah.
the question is quite practical as well, I think. And I think
Yeah.
what you said is really important, fully agree with all we've said. But in this sense, there is a practical solution, which is to preempt, use foresight, use future thinking, to create institutions, processes, in terms of form, function, etc., which create a kind of sense of ethical preparedness because we know crises are going to happen. You know, when is there not a crisis? Would be policy would be one question. So I think there are ways to do that, and maybe it's not feasible to do huge public consultations, you know, on the spur of a moment, but certainly that is such an important part of participatory research, which gathers all that together in advance of these kinds of issues and controversies and problems which arise.
And also that raises the question of developing ethical literacy right from early days, you know, school age onwards, so that it becomes part of the fabric of society, that people are much more aware of it. And then I think that makes it much less likely to be harmed when there's a crisis on. Okay, the next one is very, I'm taking them not in particular order, but this one is about certainty. How do you balance uncertain evidence with pressure from clinical institutes that need certainty? I'd say it's not just clinical institutes. I find working with government very similar, where people do want certainty. Often I find that senior decision makers want to soften any uncertainty with vague statements to move the project forward, but I instinctively do not think this is the right approach. I think this is such a good question, and it's certainly one that I've experienced over time, working as a consultant with Department of Health over many years, and with a range of policymakers, where, you know, there are differing incentives and different ways of working, and there's a drive, a feeling of need for certainty amongst some people who we are working for in that kind of situation. Whereas as researchers and as scientists, we know that nothing is 100% certain. It's degree of uncertainty that one needs to get over. So there's both, I think, ethical tensions in terms of speed, you know, doing something quickly with a less rigorous methodology that we would like to do, and then also a tension around certainty about, you know, how certain can one give the message. And I have to say, I have seen, you know, some behavioural researchers talk with much more certainty by sometimes cherry picking results to provide a narrative that will go down well in certain quarters. And for me, that's profoundly unethical, because I'm a scientist, which means one needs to be able to present things as they are. Now, one can go the opposite way and say, well, it depends on this, that, or the other, and not give policymakers what they need in terms of enough of an understanding and getting hold of enough certainty to do something with. So I think these issues are really, really tricky issues, and you know, there's no definite answer. One has to, from my perspective, weave a middle way where one can feel totally ethical as a scientist. One's not letting down the science, but also one's making that science useful and usable to those who can make use of it, because otherwise that's not ethical either, if it's just left in you know, journal articles, etc. So I'm really just saying this is a really good questions that I think a lot of researchers tussle with all the time. I'm not giving any particular answers to the question, so I don't know what other people's reflections on how they deal with that.
So I think one way of dealing with it is to make very explicit that the alternative, which often is doing nothing, is also something which carries uncertainty. There is no certainty in so much of what we do. And what in my experience, what often underlies this kind of, oh, well, if we can't be certain, we mustn't act, is using it essentially as a smokescreen for acceptance of a set of existing policies and practices that themselves have uncertainty attached to them, but it's sort of encapsulated in this sort of a sort of pseudo application of this principle, first do no harm, which sounds great. You should set a relatively high bar for acting in conditions where the actions may themselves have harmful consequences, which is, obviously it's generally in medicine that this applies. If you're going to do surgery, you want to make sure, because it involves harming the patient, you should set a reasonably high bar for it. But then it's used as a sort of catch-all, first do no harm. Oh, we can't be confident that this is going to have the effect that we hope it's going to have, and then it might have these other effects that I don't really know. And then it's basically a smokescreen for proper decision making, which is why I think in those kinds of situations you point out and you recognize that in the decision making landscape, not doing something is a decision. It's not something which is just business as usual and it's okay. Inaction is an active decision which also has uncertainty attached to it, and so there just is no getting away from having to undertake this sort of probabilistic calculus, which we all do in decision making. So I think ascribing, rather than just saying, oh well, it depends, ascribing levels of confidence to things based on the evidence is kind of what we do. We can and when you're interacting with governments and so on, they will expect you to say, well, I've got a high level of confidence in this. I'm not that confident in that. But even if you're not that confident in a particular conclusion that might be drawn, that doesn't necessarily negate it, because if you're right, the potential benefits could be enormous. So it's a combination of a sort of cost-benefit analysis and a sort of likelihood analysis, and that's what good decision making always is.
Thanks, Robert. I think we're going to have to stop it there, unfortunately, because we're running out of time. And I'm sorry we haven't got through all of the questions. There's one from Anonymous, but about ECRs. And Jessica, I wondered whether you could take that one back to Centre UB to potentially see if there's something that Centre UB might want to do, particularly for early career researchers and also PhD students, because it's a really important question. Also, one on AI. As I said, we did have a previous webinar on that. Please do go and have a look at it. And also, we will be having, on the 26th of May, we'll be presenting BR UK's statement on the use of AI in behavioural research that both Liam and Robert have been involved with. So please do come to that and spread the word. Anybody who's interested in AI and behavioural research, that is the webinar to come to. And John, sorry I didn't get to your question either, but hopefully we'll cross paths. And on that note, I hope everybody knows about the BR UK and Centre UB conference, University of Birmingham, on the 30th of June. Please do come to that. Many of us will be there, and there'll be many conversations like this, I'm sure, at it. So I think we'll close it there, but can I thank the people attending for some really excellent questions? I mean, these were great and really go to the heart of what many of us struggle with. And it kind of goes back to, I think, Robert's first presentation about if one has thought these things through in advance, discussed them, and got one's own individual or research team or departmental set of standards, it really helps with addressing these things. And I'd also say, if ever you've got any doubt or any quandary, do go to other people to discuss it. Certainly in the Centre for Behaviour Change, we do a lot of consultancy, and we're very often people are coming to the group and saying, can we discuss this? Because I'm just not sure whether we should be taking this on. And I would just leave you with, when you do consultancy or take research funding from sources that you don't know about, or agree to be on a scientific advisory committee, or give a talk to an organisation, do really look at the website, really look at who's funding these activities. I have had my fingers burnt on more than one occasion where I've been involved with something, and then I've really dug around and asked questions. And often the funders are not on the websites. Sometimes they're not publicly available. So do really ask a lot of pertinent questions from whoever's asked you to get involved with something. Because what we don't want to be doing is giving our names and our expertise and our credibility to organisations that often may be fronts for particular industries or got particular missions, or being sponsored by commercial organisations that go against our values in different ways. So complicated questions, but really important to think about these things in advance. So thank you for your questions. Thank you also, Robert and Jessica and Liam. Excellent presentations. And I think we covered a lot of ground in the time we had, and this discussion will run and run. So I hope our paths cross in various ways in the future, and we're able to pick up some of these questions. And thank you for attending and being part of it. And hope to see you at future seminars.